Hello everyone and welcome to this latest edition of the Sales Still Human Masterclass series, where the conversation is the value. My name is Vinit and I'm going to be focusing on how you onboard new sales hires and get them performing as quickly as possible in today's session. I want to start today's session by sharing some uncomfortable truths about sales onboarding and the problems that persist and keep showing up across sales organizations and the SME community as a whole. Firstly, the average B2B onboarding time is estimated to be anything between 6 to 9 months. And the more complex the sales process, the often it takes longer to onboard a sales. Now, of course, those numbers are quite nuanced because depending on the type of role within sales, depending on the industry, there will be fluctuations in terms of how long onboarding takes. So the 6 to 9 months is actually an average, but I want you to focus on that number because I want you to see it in a holistic way as opposed to just on its own. The second biggest challenge that I'm seeing so much is it's estimated that when new hires come into a business, they miss about 40% of them actually miss their first year target. Now, for me, this is perhaps an indication that sales leaders, sales managers are being too optimistic with the targets that they are setting. They just aren't realistic. Or the other indication for me is that the right infrastructure just isn't in place for salespeople, for new salespeople into the role to have a chance to succeed. And finally, the third uncomfortable truth about sales onboarding is that most onboarding still optimizes for knowledge, not performance. Now, the cost to a business of a failed hire or of a long onboarding process is huge when you factor in things like revenue, when you factor in things like the amount of time that is spent across the business in terms of onboarding this person, the recruitment costs, and so on and so forth. So actually there was a study by DePaul University that suggested that it costs roughly about £75,000 in terms of lost revenue when someone leaves and a new person is recruited. That includes the time, it includes the recruitment costs, and so on and so forth. So onboarding is a massive issue within sales organizations and the SME community. And the way I like to think about it is that if sales onboarding worked, then there'd be an easy metric that you could apply to actually figure out what that onboarding time was. The challenge though is that in every sales organization I've been in, they've never been able to do that because there's been so many different fluctuations. Now, what I often find is that the impact of slow onboarding is really underestimated in sales organizations, especially by leaders. And the impact, the consequential knock-on effect that slow onboarding has is huge. So three things that I always find and I want to kind of just highlight is that first and foremost, what tends to happen is that when you get a new salesperson who's being onboarded, there is a tendency to give that person the old leads. Well, look, you're new to the role. Here are all the leads that didn't close in the last however many months. Maybe you'll have better luck. That's the kind of mindset that manager, a leader has, and they give them all of these old leads. Now, what it ultimately leads to is an inflated pipeline. And the consequential impact of an inflated pipeline is you have unrealistic or poor forecasting. Why? Because the pipeline expectations haven't been set and the new hire is actually just doing things off their own back. Okay, so a deal looks promising to them without actually knowing that qualification rigor being applied that's relevant to the business. Secondly, what I find is that actually the salesperson is a few months down the line, they haven't made a sale yet, and confidence starts to kind of decline. So there is an opportunity on the table, and to get that opportunity over the line, the discounting mechanism is used to help build that confidence. And discounting becomes a confidence crutch in a sense, just to get that first deal over the line. Now, this sets the complete wrong mindset, the complete wrong expectation in the salesperson's mind. And really, I think this is a failure of leadership and of managers as well. And finally, the third biggest impact that I see that slow onboarding has is that the amount of time a manager spends saving a deal or getting involved in deals rather than actual coaching that new hire in terms of what good looks like. This is really a manager issue, because they don't know how to coach effectively. They haven't developed those skills. They haven't been given the toolkit to be able to coach effectively. So for me, onboarding debt compounds so fast, and it impacts an organization's revenue, profitability, and so on and so forth. So the consequential impact of not setting that new hire up for success is huge. And this is really a leadership issue in my opinion. So knowing that, what is the solution? Well, in my mind, the solution is that you have to change your approach and your mindset towards onboarding. That's from top down, from the leadership, from the manager, and from the team that are responsible for kind of bringing a new person on board, the whole recruitment process, enablement, and so on and so forth. I like to think about it as though the shift has to be from the traditional onboarding, which is all induction based, all knowledge based, and actually a knowledge accumulation, towards more of a high impact onboarding, which is about being revenue ready. So traditional onboarding is all about product walkthroughs. It's all about CRM training. It's all about how well do we understand our solution. You know what, if you go and shadow some top performers, go and actually learn what works for them and then actually become clones, because that's naturally going to hopefully help you to be able to sell that product, that service, that solution. And by the way, I'm completely kind of candid here. When I was a manager, when I first became a manager, when I first hired, these are all the mistakes that I made. I thought actually knowing the product was the most important thing to do. I thought that actually making sure that they knew how to use the CRM system and what to log and what not to log and all that stuff, I thought that was really important. I thought actually if you shadow the top performing salesperson, yeah, absolutely, you're going to pick up exactly the kind of opportunity that we want you to focus on. You'll be able to learn from them at a much quicker pace. What I realized as my kind of career evolved was that actually it doesn't work that way. And high impact onboarding requires a complete shift in terms of what is needed. So what does high impact onboarding actually look like? Well, this is all about thinking about the buyer problems before thinking about your product, your solution, your service. Thinking about the challenges from the buyer's perspective. What is going on in the buyer's world in respect to the industry that you're in, and getting the new hire thinking about that, because they need to understand the buyer's world. They need to understand how the buyer is thinking. They need to understand the pain, the challenges, the pressures on the buyers. The second most important thing is actually the decision logic. What is going on the client, the prospect's organization, and how do they actually make those decisions? A good example is that new hires often come into a business and what they're tasked with doing, what they're targeted with doing, is actually doing a whole load of demos. Now, it sounds great in principle. It sounds like the activity is fantastic because they're doing demos. But here's the thing, those demos are generic. They've built up all of this product knowledge and now they are just regurgitating that product knowledge in a demo. It is not customized to the prospect or to the client. So they are just showing up and throwing up what they know about the organization rather than actually really deeply understanding where the buyer is in their process, what next decision they need to make, what challenges they have. And the third thing with regards to high impact onboarding is that actually the standards, the expectations need to be set by the leader, by the manager. If the guardrails are not in place, if the new hire doesn't know what is expected of them, what good looks like, how you progress a sale, and at what point, what the triggers are, what the qualification criteria is to move the sale from one stage to the other, then actually you're going to be stuck with deals that are in the wrong stage of the pipeline. It's going to impact your forecasting. So in order to achieve high impact onboarding, there are 4 focus areas that I believe are critical, and commercial leaders really need to start thinking about and planning for these if they're not already. I'm sure that there are more, but these are 4 that I believe are fundamental to the success of reducing onboarding time and actually making a new hire successful. So let's go through each one of them one by one. The first one is, I've already mentioned it, it's start with the buyer's world, not yours. And new hires have to deeply understand who the ideal customer is. But here's where the difference is. Knowing the ideal customer from a marketing perspective isn't good enough. From a sales perspective, we need to understand which buyers are involved in the process at which stage. What are their pressures? What are their motivations? What is it that they really want? Because the more complex the sale, we know that there are going to be multiple buyers that are going to be involved in that process. It isn't just a case of actually having one customer avatar or one client avatar. So you have to start with the buyer's world. You have to understand actually what was the trigger that made them realize that there was a change that was needed. So the more you understand about the buyer's industry, the pressure on them, that compelling reason to act, the buyers that you're going to have to interact with, perhaps there's a user, perhaps there's a technical buyer, perhaps there's a economic buyer, a value buyer, all of those different buyers, you need to understand who they are. You need to understand actually their personalities, their roles, and so on and so forth. Now, it isn't about giving new hires thousands of opportunities to sift through and figure out actually which ones are worth pursuing. This is really about knuckling down and actually being really targeted, really focused. So the more they understand about the buyer's world, the more in tune they're going to be with actually looking out for and hearing the challenges that buyers are actually having when they're in conversation with them. Now, from a leadership perspective, what does this mean? Well, I like to think of it as though if you asked your new hire, actually, can you actually explain the cost of doing nothing without mentioning our product or service? Can a new hire do that? I think that's how I would test it as a leader. Also, how well can a new hire articulate the buyer's pain and the impact of that pain on their business? Now, if a new hire is able to understand this and articulate this, I think it's a big tick in terms of reducing onboarding time, because they're going to be able to connect with the ideal buyers in a much simpler way, in a much quicker way than trying to over-optimize in terms of knowledge. So the second critical factor that I think is gonna help to have high impact onboarding is having a playbook that guides the decisions that a new hire makes. What often happens is many organizations, the statistics are really bad in terms of most SMEs do not have a sales process. In fact, even fewer SMEs have their processes written down. What I mean is that actually organizations just do not have a playbook. They do not have a manual that says, actually, this is how we do sales. This is the expectations. These are the guardrails that we want a new hire to focus on. The guardrails often are in someone's head, and the expectation is that this new hire is going to sit with this person, and that person is going to relay to them what the expectations are, what they're supposed to do, how they're supposed to do it. The bottom line is that the new hire is overwhelmed. They're meeting so many different people. There is so much information being thrown at them. It's unrealistic to think that they're going to retain all of that information. The best thing that an organization can do is to actually capture that information in a meaningful way and present it to the new hire. And it's not about actually giving them everything. It's not about overwhelming them. It's about being very specific, and it's about actually things that are going to impact them and the way that they manage sales. It's about connecting the dots for them. What do I mean by this? I'm talking about principles. I'm talking about expectations, what those guardrails are. How do we want you to behave? How do we sell? How do we articulate value? Right? In terms of the process, what are the stages that a typical sale goes through? What do we need to qualify at each stage? And then thirdly, it's about, okay, how does this correlate in terms of the pipeline? How will we measure success? What is the expectation in terms of the pipeline activity? How long does a sale typically take to process through the pipeline? If this type of information isn't available, then you are setting that new hire up for failure. So it is the leader, it is the manager's responsibility to make sure that a playbook of sorts exists that the new hire can work to and can execute against as well. That playbook is what will ultimately help to make the new hire successful, rather than burdening them with lots of information that may or may not be useful for them right now. Remember, the goal here is to actually reduce onboarding time and to get that new hire performing as quickly as possible. So the third focus area is actually role-specific onboarding rather than generic enablement. Now, what do I mean? Well, look, there is a tendency within sales organizations to have a sales enablement department now. And to some degree, onboarding has become a little bit like compliance. And what I find is that when I talk to enablement folk, it's a case of here's a checklist of everything that a new hire needs to do. Have they met X, Y, and Z individuals in the business? Have they had training on this product? Do they understand our HR policies? Do they understand how our CRM works? So before you know it, the sales enablement team are managing this generic list of activities, and it's like a tick box exercise. Actually, that doesn't help a salesperson with onboarding, right? What is really going to move the needle from an onboarding perspective is that the onboarding is role specific. The training that they get is role specific. The information that is shared with them is role specific. Let me give you some examples. A BDR role is completely different to an account management role, is completely different to an account executive role, is completely different to an SDR role. It's nuanced because every organization will use those roles in different ways in their organization. So any onboarding has to be role specific. An account manager actually is always thinking about retention first and foremost, and then organic growth. Right? A new business hunter is thinking about net new. They're thinking about new acquisition, new logos coming into the business. Okay. Secondly, you've got to understand deal complexity by role. So I've just mentioned there the new business versus the account manager, but different types of selling into different types of industries. If you have one solution that is agnostic, can go out, actually the process is going to be different. The way that a finance organization buys might be completely different to the way a media organization buys. There's perhaps going to be a lot more compliance in a finance organization versus the media space. So whichever industry, whichever sector that the salesperson, the new hire is selling into, that needs to be factored in. That deal complexity is going to be different depending on the expectations on them, their focus areas, and their role ultimately. And the third thing is it's the sales motion. It's new logos versus retention versus expansion. The knowledge, the skills, all of those things are different. So the onboarding process has to be different. It has to be tailored, specific to the role. The key for me isn't a case of having this kind of big checklist of standardized training that every single new hire has to go through. It's about timing, and it's about what is going to be most impactful for that hire in that moment. Now, if it's a graduate first role, then guess what? Maybe some of the house rules are maybe more important. At the same time, though, if you have someone who's a little bit more experienced, then actually they understand how to conduct themselves perhaps in a sales organization. What would be really, really useful to them is actually that buyer behavior. It's actually understanding that sales process. It's understanding actually what the sales guardrails are and how we move a deal through the pipeline. Here's the most important thing though, don't assume. The biggest assumption that I've seen organizations make is that they will hire someone really senior and then just assume that they're going to just hit the ground running. And they literally just don't do most of this onboarding. So what I'm saying is that onboarding is really important, but onboarding has to be sales specific and it should never be generic enablement. Okay. And the final kind of focus area that I think is really important to impact high performance onboarding is managers must be responsible for owning the speed of that onboarding. Managers must be trained. They have to be trained to be able to coach what those observable behaviors are. They need to be able to recognize and see actually when a new hire needs help or when a new hire needs actual direction. They need to be able to inspect that deal thinking in that new hire. It isn't just about focusing on activity and compliance. They need to be able to reinforce the standards, the guardrails that are in that playbook. Now, what this means is that they are constantly going to have to test to the standards that they want that new hire to perform to. And that only happens through observation. It only happens through coaching conversation and through measuring what good actually looks like. Now, in my opinion, reps don't always fail onboarding. It just becomes a lot harder for them to succeed when a lot of the onboarding process is outsourced by managers and by leaders. When a manager says, you know what, I want you to shadow X person. And then they ask that salesperson, how did the new hire do? That's outsourcing it, right? A salesperson is a salesperson for a reason. They're actually going to give an opinion, but they're not looking at it from a coaching perspective in terms of onboarding that new hire. Okay. So for me, these are 4 critical elements that will influence and impact high performing kind of onboarding. Now, something else that I want to talk about is actually it's that mindset towards how do we measure? What do we actually think about when we're talking about high impact onboarding? Well, forget induction plans. Forget, okay, you know what? In the first 30 days, I want you to learn all of the products. Actually, let's start thinking about performance milestones that are outcome based, right? And here's what I mean. So in the first 30 days, you want a new hire to be able to run a structured discovery session that actually clearly understands and connects to the buyer problems, as an example. Rather than in the first 30 days, I want you to learn all of our products and their application. Actually make it specific to the buyer's world, first and foremost. In a 60-day period, perhaps you want them to progress a deal using actually what is important, value that is important to the buyer and the benefit of each one of the solutions, the services that you sell without actually talking about features. So benefit-led, not feature-led. And perhaps in 90 days, you want them to be able to forecast a deal accurately with the right rationale, with the risk assessed, right? Of course, these elements will differ depending on your organization's priorities. But as a leader, just ask yourself that question. What would you want a rep to demonstrate that actually they understand the sales process and they're able to engage in a meaningful conversation with the buyer? It isn't about what checklist you want them to complete to say, okay, they've had all of this training. What do you want them to demonstrate? What do you want them to show you? Now, the challenge here is that in the SME world, you've got lots of managing directors who don't come from a sales background. So it is important for them to adjust their mindset towards this because, they think that actually when a new salesperson comes on, they can give them all of this work. No, they've got to actually set that expectation, the milestones, the criteria for what good looks like. As we evolve this conversation on onboarding, there are some critical performance indicators that I believe are going to really help you to understand whether you are onboarding someone at a faster pace. I implore you, stop obsessing over how many calls someone has made. How many presentations or proposals have been shared? Have they completed all of the CRM compliance and admin? How much do they know about the product? How many demos they've made? Stop obsessing over that. That's all outcome based. Actually think about the inputs and start inspecting the quality of that input. So think about the quality of discovery meetings. Start thinking about, does this person understand the conversion logic from stage to stage? Before we even move a deal into our pipeline, there are minimum criteria that needs to be qualified. Do they understand that process? Do they understand how to articulate our value clearly? Do they understand how to match the value that we offer to a client need? Do they have that next step discipline in terms of actually understanding the decision that the client needs to make? The key thing here is start thinking about, are they capable at uncovering the problem as opposed to just logging calls, right? How are they thinking about the sales process? That's critical here. Okay, faster sales onboarding isn't just about speed, right? It is about discipline, it's about direction, and it's really about leadership intent. So it is all about setting your team up for success. And with that in mind, I'm going to leave you with these 3 takeaways. Firstly, sales onboarding speed is designed. You design it. It's not discovered. You don't leave it to chance. And if your onboarding time really varies by hire, I don't think you've got a talent problem. You've probably got a system gap. And high performing teams really engineer clarity into their onboarding. Secondly, confidence really comes from decision clarity and not product knowledge. It is your responsibility as leaders, as managers, to set your team up for success. Reps struggle not because they don't know the product. They struggle because they don't have that decision clarity. They don't know what the buyer is going to do next. They don't know what decision the buyer is trying to make or the impact that that decision is going to have. So your onboarding actually has to train their judgment, not just information kind of recall. And finally, managers are either the growth lever or they are the bottleneck. Ultimately, your managers determine that onboarding success, okay? And the managers need to be able to observe coachable actions, activities within that new hire. So guys, that ends today's session, and I really hope that you've got something from today's session. Please don't forget to hit subscribe, follow us, connect with us, and we look forward to seeing you on the next edition of the Sales Still Human Masterclass series. My name's Vinit, and thank you for joining us.